Hi, welcome everyone to this webinar discussing the topic of DB scheme run-on. So I'm Ian Mills, I'm the head of DB Endgame Strategy at BW, and I'm joined today by my colleagues Ali Taibbi and Ben Clacker. We're also delighted to be joined by Isabel France, a legal expert from A&O Shearman. So today we'll be dipping into some of the considerations around running a DB scheme on in order to generate and use surplus. A few housekeeping items, so you can submit questions using the Q&A box, which you should see next to the media window. We aim to cover those at the end, but you can submit them at any time. You can get in touch with any of your four speakers by clicking on the speaker icon, and if you have technical difficulties, then you can refer to the console help guide or put a question in the Q&A box and someone will pick it up. We'd like some feedback afterwards. We're very keen to hear how you find this webinar. We're always looking for ways to make them even more useful for you. And there's a feedback form located next to the media player. So please do fill that in at the end of the webinar. So the plan is that I will give you an overview of why this is a topical issue. Isabel will consider whether you could and should run your scheme on in this way. Then Ali's going to touch on some of the actuarial considerations. Ben will discuss how best to administer a scheme in run-on. I will cover some of the investment considerations, introduce BW Save, our new run-on proposition designed to maximize the potential benefits of running on for both members and sponsors. And then I will wrap up with some next steps for you. So why are we here? So this chart shows the aggregate PPF funding position of the UK corporate DB sector over the last few years. And as you can see, it's gone from a big deficit to a big surplus in just a few short years. There are, of course, lots of different ways that you can measure the funding of a scheme, and this is just one. But whichever measure you choose, the picture is going to be pretty similar. Many schemes are now in surplus on their long-term funding targets, and some are even in surplus on a buyout basis. Now, it should be no surprise that we ultimately found ourselves here. The only real surprise is how quickly it flipped from deficits to surpluses. Indeed, the entire UK pension funding regime has been built around the concept of prudence for many years. And very simply, this meant that we were all funding our schemes well above the expected level of assets that would be needed to pay the benefits. And so implicitly, we were in effect always working towards being in a surplus position at some point. And of course, this also means for those schemes that aren't yet in a surplus position, they should be expecting to find themselves in that position at some point in the future. So the questions that we're going to consider today around how to build up and use surplus, and indeed whether that's even the right thing to do, it should be relevant to the vast majority of DB schemes. This hasn't escaped the attention of the government. They've been looking at the DB space in a lot of detail recently, and obviously we now have a new government in place, but we don't expect the focus or really the significant outcome of the thinking to change materially. There will, of course, be different details that the new government will want to focus on. They seem to be of the view that DB schemes have been de-risking too much, and they're pinning some of the blame for the UK's very low level of corporate capital investment at the door of pension schemes. Further, the government has a very tight fiscal position. Borrowing and taxes are both very high by long-term standards. And so the government is looking for alternative sources of capital to make this investment that it thinks is necessary. And the government's sights are very much set on the DB corporate sector to help them out. So what are they proposing to do about that? Well, in short, they're trying to make running a DB scheme on more attractive by enabling sponsors to have greater flexibility in accessing surpluses, and potentially even by increasing the level of the PPF guarantee to encourage a bit more sort of adventurous risk-taking within pension schemes. And that's really what we're looking at today, is the concept of growing a surplus within a pension scheme and then using it. What do we mean by surplus? Well, Ali's going to talk later about exactly what we mean in terms of the different actuarial ways of measuring it, but I wanted to first highlight that we're interested both in current surpluses and future potential or expected surpluses. And this is illustrated by the chart here. So this is a very well-funded scheme. Assets are currently at 110 million. That's the dotted yellow line. It's got a small buyout surplus. The green line is a projection of the buyout costs for this particular scheme. And you can see that today in 2024, there's a roughly £5 million buyout surplus. However, if we project that forward over time, it becomes pretty clear that that buyout surplus is expected to grow quite significantly. So a small surplus becomes a very large surplus in just a handful of years. And this will be the case to a greater or lesser extent for pretty much every pension scheme. And it raises the key question as to whether you should buy out at the earliest possible opportunity in order to crystallize the position and remove all downside risk, or run on for a period of time in the expectation that your surplus gets larger and then buy out later once you've been able to use that surplus in some way. To answer that question, you really need to understand where surplus comes from. And there are four main reasons why a surplus is expected to grow or emerge in a DB scheme. The first one's pretty obvious, investment returns. You'll almost certainly have an investment strategy that is targeting or expecting a return in excess of the discount rate that the actuary is using for valuation purposes. And that means you're expecting your assets to grow more quickly than your liabilities. And so, in other words, your funding position will improve and a surplus will emerge. And obviously, how big that effect is going to be for your particular scheme will very much depend upon your investment strategy and the actuarial basis that's in place. Secondly, assuming your scheme is closed, as most now are, you should be expecting it to mature. And this matters especially when you're considering your funding position on a buyout basis, because simply pensioners are relatively cheap to insure compared to those who have not yet retired. And over time, you will be expecting non-retirees to retire. And so you should be expecting your buyout price to fall over time in a central case. And again, how big this effect is going to depend on the specific circumstances of your scheme, particularly the makeup of your membership. The third source is member options. So members have choices around things like taking cash commutation at retirement or transferring out of the scheme. And importantly, the terms on which these options are offered is almost less generous than a prudent valuation of the liability. So that means whenever members take these options, we're expecting surpluses to emerge on low dependency bases and on buyout bases. And again, how significant this is for your scheme is going to depend upon the makeup of your membership. Very broadly, the more deferreds you have, or the more non-retirees you have, more accurately, the greater this effect is likely to be over time. Finally, unwinding prudence. So I mentioned that the whole funding regime has been built around prudence. I've already talked about the investment returns. That's just one angle, one aspect of prudence. There are other areas such as longevity, for example. Very simply, over time, you should expect your position to improve as that surplus unwinds, as actual experience turns out, on average, to be less expensive than has been assumed in the valuations. And again, how significant this is going to depend basically on how prudent your valuation assumptions have been. So we've got all these different sources of prudence. We need to understand for any particular scheme how much surplus we're expecting to emerge from each of these areas before making a decision as to whether running on or buying out immediately is the right answer. Another key question that arises, once we recognise that we have surplus or are expecting to have surplus, is what to use it for. And there are three broad choices. Firstly, members. So members could benefit from surplus through benefit enhancements, maybe one-off lump sums, or even just retaining the surplus in the scheme to act as a buffer should something go wrong, is beneficial to members. Potentially the employer could benefit from it. A number of different ways that this could happen. Could be a refund, actually transferring cash or assets back out of the scheme to the employer, or maybe it could be used to subsidise the cost of providing benefits within the scheme, either on a DB basis or on a DC basis. Finally, you could use the surplus to give to a third party to take the scheme off your hands, either an insurer or a consolidator, such as Lara, for example. And in effect, the difference between the premium that you pay for that transaction and the expected cost, of running the scheme on is, a transfer of that surplus, and it's the insurer's profit margin that they're hoping to make from that, in simple terms. So lots of different uses potentially for surplus. So how do you decide? Well, I'm not going to talk through everything on this page because this illustrates that there's an awful lot of issues that need to be considered. So I'll just touch on a couple. Size of scheme in the top left. This is probably one of the most important areas. The scheme needs to be large enough to justify running on, so that the running costs of the scheme aren't just offset against the surplus that comes through. If your scheme is too small, you're not going to get enough surplus coming through to justify paying those running costs. Whereas if the scheme is much larger, those running costs will be, in percentage terms, much smaller, and will be a tiny proportion of the surpluses you'll be expecting to emerge. Very broadly, we think about 100 million of assets and liabilities is about the point at which it becomes economically viable to continue to run on. Schemes larger than that potentially can. Schemes lower than that or smaller than that, it's a more balanced decision. The scheme cannot, however, be too big. If your scheme is so large relative to its sponsor that it becomes an existential threat to the business, then understandably the sponsor is going to want to insure that and is going to want to buy the scheme out. Employer covenant is also highly relevant. By running on, the trustees are continuing to place reliance on the covenant to underwrite the risk. So if the covenant is weak, they're likely to prefer buyout as soon as possible. So we think run-on works best for schemes with stronger covenants. In the bottom right, we've got scheme rules and the possibility of regulatory change, obviously also highly relevant. These are largely legal considerations, so now seems like a good time to hand over to Isabel. Isabel.
Thanks, Ian, and good morning, everybody. I'm going to talk primarily about legal considerations from the perspective of the trustees, because in the end, it is likely those decisions are going to be trickier for the trustees to reach. But of course, understanding the trustees' perspective is important for the employer too. The employer needs to understand what is feasible and also where the trustees are going to come from. I always think when trustees are presented with a proposal from the employer, there's really two questions they need to ask themselves. Very basically, one, can we as trustees agree to this proposal? And two, should we do so? And those questions overlap a bit, but I think it's often helpful to break it down in that way and divorce the should from the can. After all, if you can't answer yes to the question, can the trustee agree, then it doesn't really matter whether or not the trustees think they would agree and should agree, if only they could do so. So I'm going to start with the can. And this is a question of analysing the relevant powers under the schemes, both to understand what decisions there are that the trustees and or the employer are going to have to take, whose decision it is, and importantly, to understand what is and is not permitted. There is no one answer to any of those questions because every trustee and rules is different. But at a broad level, I think it's almost inevitable that in every case, at least some aspect of any run-on proposal will require trustee and employer to agree. They may not both need to agree to everything, but in the round, probably you are going to need them both on side. It is worth saying that sometimes running on is the default. Think of a scenario, for example, where accrual has been terminated, but the scheme is ongoing. The default in practice is likely to be that the scheme is run on unless and until whoever has the power brings it to an end. However, it's unlikely that provisions relating to use of surplus will be defaults. There's likely to be positive decisions required. So what powers are likely to be relevant? Well, that does depend very much on where your scheme is in its life cycle, but also on what's proposed. I mentioned termination, continuation, and winding up. Understanding who can press those buttons is important. If the proposal is, what as Ian described, bringing in new members, bringing in DC members, then understanding how your contribution rule works, understanding whether it would permit, for example, DC contributions to be met from surplus is important. And I'd also put into that perhaps who controls expenses. If the employer is asking that scheme expenses are met out of surplus, do your rules permit that? Also important, clearly controls over use of surplus. Do the trustees currently have power to improve benefits unilaterally? Is there power to refund surplus to the employer, and what constraints apply? If your scheme doesn't have the necessary powers, that's not the end of it. In some cases, there may be statutory assistance. For example, there is statutory power in limited circumstances for the trustee to run schemes on rather than wind up. It is limited though, and it's not going to help in every case. And conversely, TPR has limited power to order wind up. But realistically, if your scheme doesn't have the powers that you need to implement the proposal, to a great extent, you're going to be reliant on the amendment power, and you're going to need to analyse very carefully any restrictions in the amendment power. I think generally, and I am generalising, there are two types of restrictions which are likely to be relevant. One is the restriction on changing the purpose of the scheme, and I'm going to come back to that in a moment. And two is restrictions on refunds of surplus to the employer. Those are, of course, extremely common. Used to be a revenue requirement that schemes couldn't refund to the employer other than on winding up. And as a result, many schemes have that restriction, not only in their rules, but entrenched in their amendment power. Of course, we're hoping to get some help here in terms of a statutory override. The government consultation looked at the possibility of introducing one. That the mood music at the time was very positive, that there was a willingness to consider really quite radical change, including the possibility of including an override that would apply to all schemes. Of course, that's not going to be the government's priority for tomorrow. They have other things to do with their first 100 days in power, but we hope that very soon we will get some clarity on how those overrides would work. Worth saying, they won't necessarily solve all problems. So, for example, if your problem is that you have a contribution rule that means you can't be using it to fund DC contributions, and that's what the employer wants to do, not necessarily the case that there will be an override for that. And of course, it may have constraints attached to it. So don't assume it will solve all problems, but hopefully it will give us some help. So what should the trustees be considering in relation to such a proposal? I think it's worth starting with sort of the basic position. Even if a trustee can afford to buy out and is in a position where it has the power to do so, it doesn't mean they have to do so. Conversely, it doesn't mean they shouldn't, but whatever they decide, they need to be able to explain why. And when I say explain why, one expects that the regulator is going to be interested in the reasons for trustees' decisions to run on, if they could afford to buy out. And also, realistically, you're going to have to communicate with members about the decision you've taken. And it's important, therefore, to think about how you would explain it. All of that points to making sure the trustees go through due process, take appropriate advice, all the usual legal bits around taking decisions, consider all relevant factors, understand the proposals. In terms of things to consider, I think just a brief comment to start with. I think trustees often feel more comfortable in agreeing proposals where they have existing powers, as opposed to proposals that require amendments. I don't think that's necessarily an important distinction. I tend to think if you are in a position where you think a proposal is the right thing to do, and the amendment power permits you to go ahead with making those changes, I wouldn't be overly worried about the fact that you have to go through that extra step. But of course, it does require that extra degree of analysis around the amendment power. I said I'd come back to the purpose of the scheme. This is a good bit of legal jargon. It's generally a principle of trust law that trustees must exercise their powers in a manner that's consistent with the purpose of the scheme. In many cases, that will be spelt out in the trust documentation, not least because that used to be a revenue requirement, and often combined with a prohibition on amending that purpose. Always need to look quite carefully at what the purpose is, whether express or implied. Mostly they're quite broad, powers that talk about provision of retirement benefits in general terms, but I certainly have seen some that would cause me to pause and think. So, for example, a purpose clause that said to provide the benefits promised under this deed might make me question whether that was sufficiently broad to allow a scheme to be run on to generate surplus. If the proposal was to admit members on a DC basis, I would want to look at whether that purpose clause was limited to providing benefits for certain groups of employees. When trustees are considering this kind of proposal, I always think of it as a balancing act. You've got a set of scales, and in one hand goes the positives, and in the other hand goes the negatives. And trustees are always going to want those scales to balance. Ideally, they'd like them to tip up a bit in favour of the pros. The big issue in terms of downside for trustees is going to be security against adverse change. And Ian and Ali are going to cover that later on, so I won't spend any time on that. But clearly, the greater the erosion of security, the more the trustees are going to have to think carefully about the proposal. In terms of upside, understanding how likely it is that surplus will be generated, thinking about the proposed member share and the expected benefits. No right answer again to what that share should be. And finally, just thinking about whether the trustee is being asked to give anything up. Think about a scenario where the scheme is ongoing and the trustee could award benefit improvements. Unusual, but not necessarily absent. If the trustee is actually being asked to agree, will only use those powers in defined circumstances, that's a relevant consideration. And then thinking about benefit improvements, trustees, I think, will always start from wanting to be fair between all members. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that all members have to have the same improvement, and Ali's going to talk about possible ways of structuring that. But trustees do need to understand the effect for all the different classes of beneficiaries and all the different subgroups. And they need to be careful to avoid pitfalls such as inadvertently exposing deferred members to annual allowance charges. And then finally, importantly, with any proposal from the employer, what happens if the trustee doesn't agree? What's the default? What are the upsides and downsides of that default? And then just very briefly, assuming you do get to a point of agreement, it's going to need to be written down. Both trustee and employer are going to want a good degree of certainty, but probably not to bind themselves absolutely. Another good bit of legal jargon, trustees shouldn't fetter their discretions. They shouldn't tie their hands unduly. Different ways in which you can deal with that, but there will be questions about whether you're agreeing now a set of principles or whether you're agreeing the detail, whether it's binding or not. Obviously, it's going to need to be future-proof. If you were signing an agreement today that involved a distribution of surplus, you might not be able to do it as and when the law changes. And also just thinking, one would expect TPR will be interested in these agreements. So making sure you think through how the agreement works, how the trustees have protected risk, how the trustees fit within the overall statutory regime. And perhaps most important of all, in terms of writing down the agreement, is an exit plan. Nobody is going to want this to go on forever. As Ian says, we're talking about a period of run-on. The employer is likely to want to be able to get out and move to buyout if it no longer wants to underwrite risk. The trustee is likely to want to protect that power, particularly if it currently could move to buyout unilaterally. And while there's no right answer as to what those exit clauses look like, I suspect they're probably going to be amongst the most hotly debated of everything that forms part of this deal. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Ali, who's going to talk about how a run-off plan might look and might be implemented.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Isabel. So what I'm going to talk about in the next few minutes is firstly the definition of surplus, and then specifically this question of the options and implications for distributing that during the run-on period. So what do we mean by surplus? So I think there are actually two questions here. So firstly, the economic value, or you comparing the assets with the best estimate value of the liabilities. So that's the expected return that you get from a low risk investment strategy, best estimate views on demographic assumptions and best you can on member options future, an allowance for expenses over time, and as Ian already referred to, an allowance for buyout at some point in the future. Now that may be some way off, it may be a couple of decades off. Now that measurement is important because it gives a realistic value of whether this is going to be worthwhile doing over the long term for both the trustees and the employer. Now, and it's also important to quantify that both in pound terms and in percentage terms, because it may be stating the obvious, but the employer is likely to be most interested in pounds, whereas everything that the trustees are concerned about is usually expressed in percentages. So the second question is then the threshold above which surplus can safely be distributed. So that's going to have a margin above the best estimate, as you'd expect, and that question is then going to affect the level of security that's retained within the scheme, and also the timing of the distribution of the surplus over time. Now, depending on how the latest consultations proceed, that could be permissible for that to be as low as a low dependency funding basis, or it could be that the trustees and employer agree that should be at a level of a buyout, perhaps even plus a margin on top of that. Now, the higher the threshold, the more security there is going to be for members, but the longer you'll have to wait to start distributing the surplus, and vice versa. So there's obviously a trade-off there. So let's look at this question of how the threshold affects the timing of the distribution of the surplus. So I've got an example scheme there. The position at the start is that there is a surplus of 100 million on my low risk best estimate basis, that at the start the scheme is 100% funded on the low dependency funding basis, that it is projected to be fully funded on a buyout basis in 10 years time, and the target date for all of those measurements is that the scheme will buy out in 20 years time. Now, if the trustees and the employer agree to start distributing the surplus at low dependency, then that can begin straight away. And in this example, this would generate £1 million a year over the next 20 years to the time of buyout. If, by contrast, they wait until the scheme is fully funded on a buyout basis, then it would have to wait for 10 years to start. But because assets will be growing more rapidly than a buyout basis measurement, when it does start, it will be at a higher rate. And in this example, it will be 2 million a year from years 11 to 20. So but everyone who's one step ahead of me will have figured out the punchline here, which is that in both cases, the total amount of surplus distributed over time will be 100 million. In other words, the best estimate of the surplus that you had to begin with, and also the amount that you'd get if you waited right until the end and distributed what was left on buyout in 20 years' time. Now, of course, timing does matter, because for trustees, it will impact on the generation of members that might benefit from this. Obviously, if you wait 20 years, then only the people who are around then can benefit from it. For employers, it also matters because by and large, they would prefer to have the cash in the business sooner rather than leave it in the pension scheme. But the key point here is that this means that both parties should be able to reach a decision on the threshold which gives the trustees the security they need without fundamentally taking away the case for doing this for the employer. So the next question I wanted to look at was this question of security, which obviously has been mentioned several times and is top of trustees' minds and advisors' minds. So if we break this down and look at where the risk actually comes from, so there are three areas, three chain events that need to happen for this to go wrong. Firstly, the scheme needs to be underfunded. Now, that element ought to be controlled to a low number by having a low risk investment strategy, and also by having a higher threshold beyond which the surplus is distributed. The second thing then is that the employer would need to fail to be able to correct that underfunding. Now, again, that ought to be mitigated and controlled to a small number by ensuring that you only do this if you have a sufficiently strong covenant, and there may be ways of enhancing that too. The third element then is the degree of potential member loss. Now, that can also be controlled to a low level because, again, investment strategy should control the variability in the funding level to a low level. And any uplifts that have been given to members through this process will also act as a potential cushion. So what you've got there is three small numbers multiplied together to give hopefully an even smaller number. And the point being that if all of that is managed well, and there are lots of levers to allow you to do that, that this process should be able to deliver a level of security comparable to buyout. And just a comment there in terms of it's at least helpful to know that in its latest funding statement, the regulator has acknowledged that this is an option that schemes and employers could be legitimately considering at this point in time. So the final question I just wanted to quickly address was this one about how surplus is allocated. And there are three hierarchy of questions, I guess. The first one being the split between the employer and members. Now, there's lots of relevant points that go into this, and Isabel has referred to some of those already. The history of how it arose, the fact that there's still an asymmetry going forward in terms of the fact that the employer will still have to put more money in if it ever became needed. What the rules say about what would happen on wind-up may affect what happens during the run-on period. So there are a number of things that are going to affect the question of how that's split between employers and members. So the next sort of hierarchy of question is then how the element that's available for members is actually split across the membership themselves. Are there going to be particular priority groups? So, for example, many schemes already have a provision for trustees and employers to consider discretionary increases for pre-97 benefits, which historically have not been guaranteed any pension increases. Or is this going to be split across the membership as a whole? In which case, one of the factors is that across the membership as a whole, any increase would be more modest. The third question then is the form of the benefit that would be provided. So is that going to be an increase in the annual level of pension? Might it be a lump sum? Is that even possible under the rules? Or should it be some sort of, let's say, removal of an inflationary cap on future pension increases rather than an immediate increase now? So there's a whole host of questions there, and I'm sure I've left out a lot of other relevant questions, but the main point, I think, is that these are all important policy decisions which should be agreed in advance, at least at the level of principle. So these are not things that you want to keep coming back to on a regular basis. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Ben.
Thanks, Ali, and good morning, everyone. So I'm just going to talk through briefly some of the administration considerations to running on your pension scheme. So, admin's really important, and we know that. It's all about paying the right money to the right members at the right time. But there are some specific considerations with running on your pension scheme. We want the administration to be smooth and efficient. We want it to be low risk. Ian's touched on this already, but we do want the surplus to go to members or the employer. We don't want it sucked into unnecessary running costs. You need an administrator and an administration platform that is flexible enough to accommodate potential additional benefit payments and increases, as the type that Ali's just been talking about. We also need the member experience, of course, to be at the heart of everything that we do, and it's crucial that that is maintained. It's also an important point to note that under running on a pension scheme, if you've got things like DC pots or AVCs that are integrated with members' benefits, it gives trustees the possibility to continue to have those benefits available for members, and is certainly something that the trustees may wish to consider when looking at the options available. So how do we go about achieving sort of low risk, efficient administration? And I think it really starts with the scheme documentation. It sounds like an obvious point to make, but it's not always quite as straightforward as it sounds. We need to ensure that scheme documentation is consolidated and in one place. In many instances over time, documents can become spread out across multiple advisors with no one having a complete set. Ideally, each document needs to have a high-level synopsis as to how it impacts the payment of benefits. The documentation can then be used to create a comprehensive benefit specification, which should detail all the benefits payable across all members and all sections. This can be used to either code the administration system or check the administration system if you're remaining with your current administrator. And then the third action here is codifying discretions. We know that many sets of trustee rules allow certain discretions for the trustee and or employer on the level of benefits paid in some circumstances, or whether or not benefits should be paid at all. We also know that the rules can be silent in some instances, and decisions are made, administration, custom and practice evolves over time. So it's important to have that captured in addition, as well as what is strictly within the rules. So by following those steps, you can be really sure of the benefits that need to be paid to all members of your scheme, and that allows benefits to be paid correctly and also valued correctly. So it's no good having really good understanding of the benefits paid if your data's not good, and certainly you need to be able to trust your data in this scenario. So I would sort of certainly say that a comprehensive data assessment is required. The TPR, common and conditional tests, are certainly a really good start, but I would sort of propose going further. We need to ensure that all relevant data fields are populated, but also with the right numbers. So there needs to be some robust testing. The list of data fields applicable for a pension scheme is incredibly long, and I certainly won't bore you all with that now. But in my experience, typical areas that need looking at are, for example, the correct tranching of preserved pensions. Transfers in constantly crops up, particularly with the attaching GMP, and certainly contingent spouses pensions is also one area that crops up an awful lot. Obviously it's not enough just to assess the data. We do need to take action. This does require time and resource, but I think it's certainly worth it in the long run. And there are clear benefits to doing this. Robust data will ensure that your valuation is correct. If you're going to run on the scheme, you want to really be sure that surplus is there and is as expected. Obvious point, but it enables members to be paid the correct benefits. And also for many schemes that look to run on, buyout may be the ultimate destination in the long run. So you may as well do this data testing up front because it will certainly need to be done before any transaction with an insurer, and will enable that process with an insurer to be smoother with more favourable pricing as well. The other point I would add that once reaching clean data, you want to ensure that it stays high condition and doesn't degrade over time. So certainly some form of annual assessment seems like a really good idea to ensure that your data is remaining as robust as possible. So technology, by doing the 2 steps I've outlined already, it enables schemes to make the best use of technology, and this is efficient administration from the administration team. Everything works, so they're spending their time helping your members, not grappling with technicalities and data. But also it enables a scheme to make the best use of online services available, so members can run quotes at the touch of a button. It's good for the member experience, but also it comes back to the point around running costs and keeping those as minimal as possible in this run-on scenario. And then the final point I would make is that online reporting for trustees as well, it minimises the governance burden, and allows things to be as efficient and slick as possible in that regard as well. So in summary, I would say that in order to achieve low risk, efficient administration, you need to be really sure of the benefits payable, clean your data, and make the best use of technology, and bear in mind that running on may also allow members to retain greater flexibility in how they take their benefits. So that concludes what I have to say about administration considerations, and I'll hand over to Ian, who's going to talk about some of the investment specifics.
Thanks very much, Ben. So a scheme that is running on is obviously going to need the right investment strategy. And I think it's always worth thinking about the strategic principles that you're trying to adhere to when designing a strategy. So that's where I thought I'd start. So firstly, clearly we need the right amount of return, not so much that the risk is too big, but enough to generate a reasonable amount of surpluses coming through over time. Risk is clearly important, so we need to control risks. This doesn't mean no risk, but as Ali has alluded to, it probably means a relatively low level of risk, but importantly, a level that everyone is comfortable with. We need to be clear what we mean by risk. So we think it's helpful to think about this in two ways: short-term risks. So how can the funding position deteriorate over, say, a one-year period? So measures like value at risk or funding level volatility, remain useful. But it's also important to recognise the longer-term risks, the risk that members don't get paid their benefits in full. So this requires a longer-term projection. And these two risk measures can conflict. So it's really important to define, upfront what we're trying to achieve, what are the objectives, what are the constraints. Strategy needs to be suitably liquid. Schemes in run-on, may want or need to pivot to buyout, potentially at short notice if the covenant deteriorated, for example. So we need to make sure there's sufficient liquidity to enable that to happen. That doesn't mean no illiquid assets. It means understanding the liquidity and having a plan. Furthermore, if you're using surplus in some way, then as Ben has alluded to, you want to make sure that that is a real surplus. So this means limiting the allocation to assets that have quite subjective valuations. Finally, given the primary purpose of the scheme is to pay the pensions, you'll want to be confident that that's going to be possible in all scenarios and therefore potentially pivot to buyout. So ensuring that the strategy is buyout aware, I think is a very sensible thing to do to control the risk that the buyout position deteriorates substantially. So what does this actually then look like in practice? It's likely to be a strategy that is predominantly bond-based, with a significant allocation to LDI assets to control risk. There may be a small allocation to return-seeking assets. That's the bit in yellow. But we're certainly not talking about going back to an old 70% growth portfolio or anything like that. So most of the assets will be liquid, but where illiquid assets are held, they will be consistent with those strategic principles that I outlined a moment ago. Now, we're not saying this is the only answer, but we do think a lot of run-on strategies will end up looking something like this. We also need to give thought to how the strategy is going to be governed and implemented. So, we spent a lot of time thinking about this recently, how to do this in the best way possible. And we think that keeping the governance simple is going to be important, but it also needs to be sufficiently robust, especially if you're using that surplus. Costs will be critically important. Every pound that is spent on running the scheme is going to either impact the benefits that members are going to receive through the enhancements that they might be given, or the company in terms of the financial return that it can get from the surplus. So we've been thinking hard about how to manage costs as well as possible. We've been working with a number of asset managers to develop low governance solutions that take away some of the burden from trustees and some of the burden from consultants in order to keep costs as low as possible. Finally, we do expect schemes to have fewer decisions to make going forwards on the investment strategy, but that's not no decisions. There will still be a need to adjust the portfolio from time to time. So we think planning ahead and building a clear decision-making framework around the scenarios in which the strategy should be tweaked enables schemes to move more quickly at the right time and therefore maximize value for all parties. So thinking and planning ahead is going to be critical. So that's a whistle-stop tour of the investment considerations. I just wanted to wrap up with two things. Firstly, just to introduce our new DB run-on proposition. We spent an awful lot of time thinking about this and developing this over the last few months, and hopefully we've shown some of the thinking that's gone into that. What this proposition is really trying to do is to run the scheme on in a highly efficient manner whilst maintaining full strategic flexibility by ensuring that the scheme is able to quickly pivot to buyout should that be necessary, because we think it's always a good idea to plan ahead and think about the sort of disaster scenarios, and there certainly are some, and therefore we think that that is the right thing to do for trustees. So what are the next steps? Well, there are an awful lot of schemes out there currently with a buyout target, and in most cases that was an implicit assumption that the scheme would buy out as soon as it became feasible. But we think that some of these schemes, at least, would be better served by running on for a few years before then buying out. So if this sounds like you, we'd encourage you to reconsider your end game and think about whether run-on might be a better option, at least for a few years, and especially if the regulatory regime changes in the way that Isabel outlined earlier that there is potential for. If that is of interest, the next step should probably be a feasibility study. So we can help analyse the financial implications of running on for a period and then buying out versus buying out at the earliest opportunity. And importantly, that would consider both the member perspective and the sponsor perspective, including the impact on the security of benefits for members. Because clearly, if money is coming out of the scheme, then all else being equal, the security of members' benefits is being diminished in some way. And the goal of the feasibility study really is to identify whether there's likely to be an attractive solution from both a member and sponsor perspective. Assuming there is, the next step after that is to work out exactly how you could run on, to actually build a run-on strategy for your scheme. So that's got two elements to it really. The first is how are you going to build that surplus over time? And then the second is how are you going to use that surplus over time? And that's where our new proposition really comes into its own. So we can help you ensure that you maximise the benefits for both parties, for members and sponsors. Now we've got some time, roughly 15 minutes left for some questions. I can see that there are some questions coming through. So let me scroll down to the bottom. Let's start with the first one. So the question here is, what would the rationale be to enhance benefits for members over those outlined in the trust deed and rules? So really, this is a question, I guess, implicitly about why shouldn't the sponsor get 100% of the surplus? Why do members need to get anything at all? I guess is another way maybe to frame that question. Ali, do you want to comment on that, and maybe Isabel?
Sure. Yeah, I can start off, and then Isabel, perhaps you could follow. So I guess, there are lots of trust deed rules that already contain a provision around, for example, the trustees and employers looking regularly at pre-97 benefits because they've not been guaranteed any increases in the past. And certainly my experience is that trustees approach that kind of diligently in terms of trying to get those increases on a regular basis. Obviously, in the recent past, those have generally not been provided. So clearly, I suppose there's an example of a situation where the trustees have generally been looking to do what they can to deliver those discretionary increases. So that was one of my examples of maybe a priority group that should be considered if these do become more feasible in future. And then I suppose the second question is, the trustees are being asked to do something other than buy out and fully secure the benefits. So that does create, as some of the other questions have highlighted, at least some risk, potential regret risk if this doesn't go. Now, I've said that, in many cases that can be managed very tightly, but ultimately it is different. It is not a no risk scenario, and providing some benefit enhancement is a small compensation for that. I still think ensuring security is paramount, but providing increases helps restore that balance. And also, if something does go wrong in future, then having provided increases provides a cushion so that for members to lose out, the level of cutback would have to eat into the benefits, the uplifts in benefits that have been provided. So I guess, just a couple of observations around why it is at least reasonable to consider increases for members in this scenario. Isabel, have you got anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think it does come down to the fact that the trustee is looking at the downsides, and if there are downsides in terms of additional risk, the trustee is going to want something in return. It's also maybe worth saying that although we don't quite know where the consultation will come out, the tone of the consultation document was very much in terms of sharing surplus. I suspect it's unlikely we will end up with legislation that would simply allow the employer to take all surplus out, even in a non-contributory scheme. But I think it's a fair challenge, and particularly in a scheme which is non-contributory, that fact is part of the matrix that the trustee would need to consider in deciding whether the proposal was appropriate or not.
Thanks. So got another question here about regret risk that, Ali just alluded to this. So, what about regret risk for trustees if they don't pursue a buyout when they had the chance to do so and conditions later go against them? Removing that opportunity. Maybe I'll take this one in the first instance and then see if anyone else wants to chip in. I think that is an issue. That if a scheme is fully funded on a buyout basis and could buy out immediately, clearly by running on, the possibility that buyout position deteriorates, is there. I think that's why it's really important to do, that analysis that I referred to earlier, looking at how surplus is expected to evolve, and try and put a likelihood on that, put a probability on it. Look at how likely it is that there won't be a buyout surplus again at some point in the future. And often what you will find is that it's quite low, particularly for an immature or relatively immature scheme where there are lots of sources of surplus that are likely to be coming through. I think you can also turn the question on its head. I think there's a regret risk the other way. That if there is an opportunity to run the scheme on for the mutual benefit of both sponsor and members, then there could be a regret risk that if you did buy out and you forego that possibility, that you might be looking back in a few years' time at other companies, other pension schemes that have run on and have been able to return money to the sponsor one way or the other, and potentially have been able to increase members' benefits over and above the level that they could have bought out at. So I think really this is why it's important to do the analysis properly. Really think about it carefully, because the future is unpredictable and we cannot say for sure what the best strategy is, but we should go into it with our eyes open, consider all the information that's available in front of us and make the decision that on balance we think is the better one. Anybody else like to chip in? Any of the other presenters?
Only very quickly that the obvious point again that the threshold which is set for distributing surplus can make a significant difference to that. Obviously, if you set it at a level of buyout plus a margin, then you're going to significantly mitigate against that regret risk.
Yeah. Okay. Next question. So this question is, I guess, linked to that. This next question, it's around distributing surplus at self-sufficiency, basically questioning whether we should be doing that or not, or do we need to be sure that we can secure member benefits in full, noting that even the best covenant can still go wrong, especially over a longer time scale. Is that one for you, maybe, Ali?
Yeah,
I think it's back down to the question of what the threshold is, isn't it? Yeah.
No, it is down to the threshold, and I, from the cards on the table, I put that there because the consultation was at least opening up with that question to say whether it could be set at a low dependency level. So depending on where that ends up, all I was saying was that the legal framework may make it permissible to do so at that level. So just recognizing that possibility. But in all honesty, I agree with you. I think it's in many cases that won't be enough. Trustees would typically be looking for something more than that. And I guess coming back to this question of avoiding regret risk and being in a very secure position, something like a buyout level of funding would be most comforting to the trustees, I would have thought. Yeah. But that's not to say, not to say that's the only way it can be done. It does also come back to how strong the covenant is as well. That may make the case for supporting it at a lower level. And if the employer is keen on accelerating the timing of it, then the threshold may be acceptable. But I personally thought that would be quite hard work.
Yeah, and I guess there's we haven't really talked about it in any detail. I alluded to it at the beginning. As part of the consultation, one of the things that's been considered is potentially increasing the level of PPF compensation. I think that sort of interacts with this as well, doesn't it? In that, if you have a guarantee from the PPF that on insolvency they would pay the full scheme benefits, for example, that might enable you to be a bit more relaxed about the level at which surplus can be used within the scheme. Because although there might be a buyout deficit on an insolvency, if the PPF is covering it, and obviously there'll be a cost to that insurance, but that provides an additional layer of security for members that could enable you to be a bit more relaxed about that question potentially.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. There's a question here, about the possibility of DB schemes reopening. Do we think that that's something that we will see? I mean, maybe if I just start on that one. I mean, I've got a client. In fact, I think they're actually on the webinar that hasn't reopened the scheme, but has effectively decided not to close it, which is a slightly different question, but ends up in the same place. As using that DB surplus, to support the cost of accrual. So I think it's possibly something we'll see. I think it's quite a big leap to reopen a DB scheme, especially with all the rules around the sort of minimum benefits that you can offer. It's it's an expensive way to provide pensions still, but maybe we'll see a few. I know IBM did so in the US recently, but I don't think they have done in the UK, to the best of my knowledge. Anybody else want to chip in?
No, it's a question that I'm quite interested in, and part of me thinks that everybody in the industry has been quite forceful in sort of wanting to defend the position of open schemes and wanted to keep them open and provide as much encouragement as possible to keep them open. And it's only a sort of small step from that to say, well, what's different about reopening schemes in that scenario, because all the same benefits apply. But like Ian, I have to say, it feels like we're a little some way off from employers being able to just feel comfortable about that at the moment. But let's see what the future holds.
Yeah, we've probably got time for maybe just one more question. This is probably one more for you, Isabel. So the question is, run-on and surplus distribution is yet another example of the extension of trustee fiduciary duty. Do trustees have the legal comfort and security to perform all that's been discussed without potentially falling foul of their fiduciary duty?
Yep, happy to take that one. And I know I've said this multiple times, but that there is no one right answer. But broadly, provided the trustees go through a really rigorous process, are comfortable with the answers in terms of downside risk, possible upside, and comply with whatever restrictions their trustee and rules impose, then trustees should not be in breach of their fiduciary duty. That's not to say it's impossible. If you have a set of trustee and rules that are very tightly drawn and the trustees go beyond that, then that could be a problem. But really, I think it's the same point as for any trustee decision: proper understanding of your powers, proper understanding of your duties, proper understanding of the terms that you're negotiating. I also think, we talked a little bit about exit plans. I think trustees who enter into this kind of arrangement are likely to want to keep it under regular review. We talked about regret risk, and I think that's part of the answer on regret risk too, that there's an ongoing monitoring process to make sure that a decision which feels acceptable on day one remains acceptable, that the trustees remain comfortable with the balance of risk. So I think in summary, trustees can probably get there, but if you like, the threshold of what they need to be satisfied about in order to be able to get there is going to be very specific to the circumstances of an individual scheme.
Okay. Right, well, we've got just under a minute left, so that's probably a good time to draw to a close. There are other questions that have come in on the Q&A. So what we'll try and do is respond to those people that raise those questions directly. But yeah, I just want to say thank you very much for attending our webinar. Hopefully you found it useful and insightful, and has given you food for thought. Thank you very much.
Thank you.